The autumn sun was beginning its descent behind the oak trees that lined Maple Street in suburban Denver, casting long shadows across the neighborhood. It was a Friday evening, the kind where children played outside until streetlights flickered on, and parents sat on porches with cold drinks, relieved the workweek was finally over. 7-year-old Emma Martinez had been asking her mother all afternoon if she could go outside to play. Exhausted from a double shift at the hospital, had relented with the condition that Emma stay in their front yard where she could see her from the window. Emma was not like other 7-year-olds. While most children her age were content jumping rope or riding bicycles in mindless circles, Emma possessed an unusual gift, a photographic memory that had baffled her teachers and intrigued child psychologists since she was 5 years old. She could read a page in a book once and recite it verbatim weeks later. She could describe conversations in intricate detail after hearing them just once. Her kindergarten teacher had suggested advanced placement, but, wanting Emma to have a normal childhood, had politely declined. Emma was quiet, observant, and remarkably perceptive for her age traits that would soon place her at the center of an extraordinary series of events. That particular Friday evening, Emma played with her collection of small ceramic figurines on the front porch steps. She'd arranged them into an elaborate storyline, narrating each character's dialogue in different voices. She was completely absorbed in her imaginary world when she heard it, a sharp, unmistakable sound of breaking glass followed by raised voices. Emma's head snapped up. The sound came from down the street, approximately 3 houses away, at the home of Mrs. Henderson, an elderly widow who lived alone. Emma's mother would later blame herself for not immediately pulling her daughter inside, but in those first few seconds, assumed it was just neighborhood kids or a car accident. Emma, however, felt compelled to investigate. She'd always been curious about the world around her, asking questions that adults struggled to answer. Before her mother even noticed she'd moved, Emma had crept down the front walkway toward the commotion, staying low behind the neighbors' hedges. What Emma witnessed in the next 7 seconds would become the centerpiece of one of the most unusual legal cases in Colorado's history. The front door of Mrs. Henderson's home had been open, and a man was climbing through the shattered front window, his movements quick and practiced. The porch light illuminated his face with almost theatrical clarity. Emma's photographic memory locked onto every detail. He was tall, approximately 6 feet, with a muscular build. His face was sharp and angular, with a prominent scar above his left eyebrow that ran from his temple nearly to his nose, clearly the result of old violence. His nose had been broken at some point and healed slightly crooked, giving him an unsymmetrical appearance. He had cold, calculating eyes, the color Emma would later describe as like dirty, thin lips set in a grim line of concentration. He wore a distinctive black leather jacket, the kind motorcycle enthusiasts wore, with silver zippers and a faded band logo on the back. His hands were large and suggesting a life of physical labor or violence. A tattoo of a serpent wrapped around his right forearm, its mouth open in a perpetual hiss. Emma memorized all of it, every scar, every tattoo, every distinctive feature, her extraordinary memory photographing the scene like a living camera. The man disappeared into the house. Moments later, Mrs. Henderson's screams pierced the evening air, a sound of pure terror that would haunt Emma's dreams for months to come. Emma's courage evaporated instantly. She turned and ran back toward her house, her small legs pumping frantically. She burst through her front door just as her mother was reaching for her car keys, having finally realized something was seriously wrong. Someone broke into Mrs. Henderson's house, Emma screamed, her words tumbling out in a panicked rush. Immediately called 911, her voice steady despite her racing heart. She kept Emma inside, away from the windows, holding her close as they waited for the sirens. Within minutes, the quiet suburban street erupted into controlled chaos. Police cars arrived with flashing lights and wailing sirens. An ambulance pulled up behind them. Officers cordoned off Mrs. Henderson's property with yellow crime scene tape. Mrs. Henderson was found bound in her bedroom, shaken but physically unharmed. The thief had stolen her jewelry, her late husband's watch collection, and approximately $3,000 in cash from a bedroom safe. The suspect had apparently fled through the back door when he heard the approaching sirens, leaving behind a trail of disturbed earth in Mrs. Henderson's garden and a partial footprint near the fence. When Detective James arrived at the scene, he was a 15-year veteran of the Denver Police Department, known for his meticulous attention to detail and his ability to connect seemingly unrelated evidence. He'd worked hundreds of cases, but something about this one felt different. As he conducted interviews with neighbors, he learned about Emma, the young witness who'd seen the suspect's face. Approached Emma with the gentleness of someone trained in interviewing children. He sat down in the Martinez living room, making himself as small and non-threatening as possible, speaking in calm, measured tones. He didn't ask leading questions or plant suggestions. He simply asked Emma to describe what she'd seen. What emerged was astonishing. Emma recounted details with a precision that had rarely encountered in eyewitness testimony, even from adults. She described the scar, the crooked nose, the serpent tattoo, the leather jacket, even the band logo on the back. She estimated his height by comparing him mentally to Mrs. Henderson's front door frame. She noted the condition of his hands and his movements, the way he moved with practiced confidence, like someone who'd done this before. "You just solved this case," told Emma, his voice filled with genuine admiration. He meant it. With her description, along with the partial footprint and stolen items, they had a solid lead. The description matched the known criminal database, specifically a career burglar named, who'd served 5 years for home invasion and had been released from prison just 18 months earlier. Was arrested within 48 hours at a pawn shop attempting to sell Mrs. Henderson's jewelry. Everything seemed straightforward. The case appeared to be a slam dunk for the prosecution. But neither, nor Emma, nor anyone else in that neighborhood could have predicted the legal nightmare that was about to unfold. One that would pit a 7-year-old child's testimony against a skilled defense, attorneys' ruthless tactics, and ultimately force the entire judicial system to confront uncomfortable questions about how it treated its most vulnerable witnesses. For now, though, Emma went to bed that night with her mother holding her, unaware that her extraordinary gift, the photographic memory that had always set her apart, was about to become both her greatest strength and her deepest source of trauma. The terrible night had ended, but its consequences were only just beginning. The arraignment took place on a gray Monday morning at the Denver District Court, just 4 days after the break-in at Mrs. Henderson's home. Sat in the defendant's chair, his face a mask of indifference as charges were read: burglary, theft, and assault. Detectives sat in the prosecution's section, confident they had a strong case. The partial footprint matched shoe size. The stolen jewelry had been recovered from his apartment. And most importantly, they had Emma's eyewitness testimony describing him with remarkable precision. But what didn't anticipate was Michael. Was a defense attorney with a reputation that preceded him like a storm cloud. 53 years old, impeccably dressed in handmade Italian suits, with piercing gray eyes and the demeanor of a man who never lost a case he truly cared about winning, specialized in one thing: discrediting witnesses. Over his 25-year career, he'd successfully defended 32 clients accused of serious crimes, primarily by systematically dismantling the credibility of eyewitnesses. He understood human psychology better than most psychologists, knew how to plant seeds of doubt that would grow into forests of reasonable uncertainty. When first reviewed the case file and saw that the primary witness was a 7-year-old child, he didn't panic or despair. Instead, he smiled. For him, it was an opportunity. Within days of his assignment to the case, filed a motion challenging the reliability of child eyewitness testimony. His legal brief was masterful, citing decades of psychological research showing that children's memories are highly suggestible, prone to contamination through leading questions, and easily influenced by authority figures like police officers. He argued that detective, despite his experience, had likely conducted interviews in a way that shaped Emma's memory rather than simply recorded it. The prosecution countered that Emma's testimony was corroborated by physical evidence, the footprint, the stolen goods, the description's accuracy, but was just getting started. He filed a motion to exclude Emma's testimony entirely, arguing it was fundamentally unreliable. He demanded a hearing where experts would testify about the reliability of child witness testimony. The legal warfare intensified over the following weeks. The prosecution brought in a child psychology expert who that some children, particularly those with superior cognitive abilities, could provide remarkably accurate eyewitness accounts. Expert countered, presenting research about false memories and the malleability of children's recollections. The judge, after careful deliberation, ruled that while Emma could testify, her testimony would be considered with appropriate caution given her age. It was a partial victory for both sides, but it meant something crucial. The case was no longer a simple open and shut prosecution. Reasonable doubt had been introduced into the equation before Emma had even taken the stand. Back at the Martinez home, Emma's world was falling apart in ways that had nothing to do with courtroom procedure. The first sign of trouble came about 2 weeks after the crime. Emma had always been a child who slept peacefully, rarely waking before dawn. Now found her daughter screaming in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, her sheets twisted around her small body. In the nightmare, the man with the scar was chasing her through darkness, his face growing larger and more terrifying with each step. "It's okay, baby. It was just a dream," whispered, holding her daughter close, but her own heart was pounding. The nightmares became nightly. Sometimes Emma screamed. Sometimes she simply woke up sobbing, unable to articulate what had frightened her so intensely. During the day, Emma's behavior shifted dramatically. The quiet, observant girl who'd once been lost in imaginative play now seemed anxious and withdrawn. She stopped playing with her ceramic figurines. She refused to play outside, even on the sunniest days. At school, her teacher, Mrs., reported that Emma had become withdrawn and distracted. She'd always been an exceptional student, but now she was having trouble concentrating. She'd stare out the window for long periods, her mind clearly elsewhere. Consulted with Emma's pediatrician, Dr. Sarah Mitchell, who recognized the symptoms immediately, post-traumatic stress responses in a child. Dr. Mitchell referred the family to Dr., a child psychologist who specialized in trauma. During their first session, Emma could barely speak about what she'd witnessed. She'd sit quietly, picking at her fingernails, occasionally looking up with frightened eyes. She saw something violent, Doctor explained during a parent consultation. The break-in, Mrs. Henderson screams, these were traumatic events for a young child. Now she's being asked to relive and recount those events in a legal context. For Emma, that's compounding the trauma. Doctor prescribed cognitive behavioral therapy techniques specifically designed for child trauma. He taught how to help Emma process her emotions, how to create a sense of safety in her home, but nothing seemed to fully alleviate Emma's anxiety. The girl who'd once been so confident, so observant and quick-witted, now seemed fragile and broken. As weeks turned into months and the trial date approached, Emma's anxiety escalated to new heights. She developed what Doctor identified as mild agoraphobia, a fear of open or unfamiliar spaces. The thought of sitting in a crowded courtroom, facing the man she'd identified, having a harsh defense attorney question her judgment, proved almost unbearable. Had to fight back her own tears when she found Emma hyperventilating in her bedroom one evening, unable to articulate the specific trigger but clearly terrified about something. "I don't want to go to court," Emma whispered to her mother one night. "I don't want to see him again. What if I get it wrong? What if I can't remember? What if he's not the bad man and I made a mistake?" Held her daughter, her heart breaking. "You're not going to make a mistake, sweetheart. You're the bravest girl I know." But wasn't sure she believed her own words. She'd read about trials where child witnesses recanted, where they froze on the stand, where their testimonies became so muddled that juries couldn't rely on them. She'd researched and found his criminal history, a violent, dangerous man with no remorse for his crimes. The thought that he might go free because her traumatized daughter couldn't testify effectively kept awake at night. It was during one of these sleepless nights, while scrolling through articles about courtroom procedures and child witnesses, that noticed an email from Detective. He'd been following Emma's case closely, genuinely concerned about the child's. In his email, he mentioned something that caught attention: a new program involving certified therapy dogs to support child witnesses in courtrooms. He mentioned one dog in particular, a German shepherd named Duke, whose handler was Officer Sarah. The program had shown remarkable results in preliminary trials in other districts. Wasn't making any promises, but he was asking if would be interested in exploring this option. Immediately called back. For the first time in weeks, she felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe there was something, someone, or something that could help her daughter face what was coming. That evening showed Emma a photograph on Detective's phone. It was a large German shepherd with kind eyes and a calm expression. The dog's name was Duke. Emma stared at the photograph for a long time. Then very quietly she asked, "Do you think he's nice?" "I think he might be exactly what you need," replied, praying she was right. The morning Emma met Officer Duke started like any other morning, with her waking up in a panic, her nightmares having plagued her sleep once again. Found her daughter sitting on the edge of the bed, staring blankly at the wall, her small hands trembling slightly. It was a Tuesday, 3 weeks before the trial was scheduled to begin, and had arranged for Officer Sarah to bring Duke to their home for an initial evaluation and introduction. Emma dressed slowly, moving through her morning routine with the disconnected movements of someone going through the motions of living rather than truly living. She had no appetite for breakfast, pushing cereal around her bowl without taking a single bite. Sat across from her at the kitchen table, trying to maintain an upbeat demeanor despite her own anxiety. "Officer is coming today, remember," with Duke, ventured, attempting to generate some enthusiasm. Emma nodded slightly but said nothing. Over the past few weeks, she'd become increasingly withdrawn, speaking only when necessary, her voice barely above a whisper. Doctor, her psychologist, had warned that this level of shutdown could indicate depression developing alongside her post-traumatic stress symptoms. The stakes of this meeting with Duke had risen significantly. It wasn't just about courtroom support anymore. It was about whether anything could reach the traumatized child Emma had become. At precisely 10:00 a.m., a white police SUV pulled into the Martinez driveway. Officer Sarah emerged first, a woman in her early 40s with kind eyes and the confident bearing of someone who'd spent years working with both dogs and traumatized people. Behind her, on a sturdy leash, came Duke. The German shepherd was magnificent, large without being intimidating, with a rich tan and black coat, alert ears and eyes that seemed to radiate intelligence and calm. Despite his impressive size and police training, there was something inherently gentle about him. Duke moved with the grace of an athlete, his movements precise and controlled, every muscle speaking of discipline and training. Emma stood at the screen door, watching, gently placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder and opened the door. "This is Officer," said softly, "and this is Duke." Officer approached slowly, deliberately, with movements designed not to startle. She extended her hand to Emma in greeting, not to shake, but simply to show the child that she meant no harm. "Hello, Emma. I've heard some wonderful things about you," Officer said in a warm, genuine voice. "This is Duke. He's been hopping to meet you today. Would it be okay if we sat in your living room for a while?" Emma nodded mutely and stepped aside. The four of them, Emma, Officer, and Duke, settled in the living room. Officer allowed Duke to move at his own pace. The dog, with the intuition that made him perfect for his work, immediately sensed something about Emma. He approached her slowly, not aggressively or with the typical dog enthusiasm, but with a deliberate, measured approach. Duke sat at a distance from Emma, not crowding her, giving her the space and control she needed. He looked at her with those intelligent eyes, eyes that seemed to understand without judgment or expectation. Duke is trained to work with people who've been through difficult things, officer explained. He doesn't need you to do anything or say anything. He just wants to be near you. Sometimes that's enough. For several minutes, nothing happened. Emma and Duke simply existed in the same space, observing each other. Then, almost imperceptibly, Emma's hand moved toward the dog. Duke remained perfectly still, allowing her to initiate contact. When her small fingers touched his fur, something shifted in Emma's body. Her shoulders, which had been tense and hunched, relaxed slightly. Her breathing, which had been shallow and rapid, slowed. Officer explained Duke's background as they sat there. How he'd been trained since puppyhood for victim support work. How he'd helped dozens of children through traumatic experiences. How his ability to read human emotion was almost supernatural. She described how Duke would remain completely calm regardless of external chaos. How his presence had been proven to reduce cortisol levels, stress hormones, in traumatized children. How his steady, unconditional acceptance could help reestablish a sense of safety and trust in a world that had become terrifying. During the trial, officer said, Duke will be there for Emma. He won't perform tricks or be a distraction. He'll simply be a presence, steady, calm, and completely on Emma's side. Studies have shown that children who testify with animal support present more coherent testimony, experience less anxiety, and recover more quickly from the trauma of testifying. Over the next hour, Emma began to open up slightly. She didn't speak much, but she started asking quiet questions about Duke. What was his favorite food? How old was he? Had he ever been scared? Officer answered each question patiently, and Emma seemed to absorb each response like a person who'd been in the desert finally finding water. Would you like to learn some of Duke's commands? Officer asked. Sometimes having a sense of control, being able to ask Duke to do something, helps people feel more empowered. Emma nodded. Officer taught her to say sit, down, and paw. Each time Emma gave a command and Duke responded immediately and perfectly, something in her face changed. For the first time in weeks, Emma smiled, not a big smile but a genuine one. As the session wound down, Officer explained that they'd have regular meetings over the next 3 weeks to build Emma's confidence and strengthen her bond with Duke. They'd practice testifying while Duke was nearby, simulating courtroom scenarios to help Emma become comfortable with the dog's presence during the trial. The most important thing to remember, Officer told Emma directly, is that Duke believes in you. He sees your courage. And when you're in that courtroom feeling scared or overwhelmed, you can look at Duke, and he'll remind you that you're not alone. After Officer and Duke left, Emma was noticeably different. She ate dinner that night, actually ate, not just pushed food around her plate. She asked her mother questions about what would happen in court, questions that suggested a return of her natural curiosity. That night, she still had a nightmare, but it was less severe, and she seemed to recover from it more quickly. Over the following 3 weeks, Emma and Duke became inseparable during their sessions. They met 3 times a week at Doctor's office, which had been specially set up to resemble a courtroom. Emma practiced her testimony while Duke lay beside her. Officer gradually increased the difficulty of the simulated cross-examination, with another attorney asking Emma the kinds of challenging questions that Michael would likely pose. With each session, Emma became more confident. Her voice grew stronger. She learned to pause and think before answering, rather than becoming flustered. Most importantly, she learned that Duke's presence didn't change the truth of what she'd witnessed. It simply made it possible for her to tell that truth without being consumed by fear. 1 week before the trial, during their final preparation session, Emma turned to Officer and asked a question that demonstrated how far she'd come. Will Duke be scared when we go to court? Officer smiled. "No, sweetheart, Duke isn't scared of anything, but he'll be there to make sure you're not scared either." Emma reached over and placed her hand on Duke's head. The dog turned slightly and licked her cheek once, gently. It was a moment of perfect understanding, a girl and a dog, connected by mutual trust and the shared understanding that sometimes courage isn't about being fearless. Sometimes it's about facing your fears with someone who believes in you completely. The trial was now 3 days away. Judge Harold had been presiding over cases in the Denver District Court for 32 years. He was a man of principle, a strict constitutionalist who believed that courtroom procedures existed for a reason, to ensure fairness, to protect the rights of the accused, and to maintain the integrity of the judicial system. He was not known for being sympathetic to emotional appeals or unconventional requests. If anything, his reputation was the opposite. He was the judge who strictly followed the rules, who rarely deviated from established procedure, who believed that sentiment had no place in law. When Judge received the prosecution's motion requesting that Officer Duke be permitted to remain in the courtroom during Emma Martinez's testimony, his immediate instinct was to deny it outright. It seemed like exactly the kind of emotional manipulation that had no place in a courtroom. How could a jury remain impartial if they saw a police dog, a symbol of law enforcement, sitting beside the witness? Wouldn't that prejudice them in favor of the prosecution? Wouldn't it compromise the defendant's right to a fair trial? He called his law clerk, a sharp young woman named Jennifer Wu, into his chambers. "What's your initial reaction to this motion?" he asked, sliding the document across his mahogany desk. Jennifer read it carefully. "It's unusual," she said thoughtfully, "but the prosecution has cited some interesting research. There are preliminary studies showing that therapy animals can reduce anxiety in child witnesses without affecting testimony accuracy. It might be worth a hearing." Judge grunted noncommittally and began reviewing the motion himself. The more he read, the more conflicted he became. He'd seen plenty of child witnesses testify over his 32 years on the bench. Some performed admirably under pressure. Others fell apart, their testimony becoming incoherent or contradictory under the stress of cross-examination. He knew that children were more vulnerable to anxiety and intimidation than adult witnesses. But allowing a police dog into the courtroom, that was unprecedented in his experience. And predictably, defense attorney Michael responded with a motion of his own, arguing vehemently against the request. His legal brief was, as always, masterfully constructed. He cited case law suggesting that any factor that might prejudice a jury against the defendant violated the defendant's constitutional rights. He argued that the presence of a police dog would send a message to jurors that law enforcement endorsed the child's testimony, thereby contaminating their impartial judgment. He quoted prominent legal scholars who warned against allowing emotional appeals to override procedural fairness. "Your Honor," wrote, "this request is nothing more than a clever psychological manipulation designed to evade the fundamental rules of evidence and fair trial rights. The prosecution, lacking sufficient evidence, seeks to substitute emotional sympathy for legitimate proof. This court must not allow it." Judge scheduled an emergency hearing for the Friday before the trial was set to begin the following Monday. The courtroom was packed, not with ordinary curious onlookers, but with legal professionals, journalists, and child advocacy groups who recognized the significance of the decision. This wasn't just about one case. It was about establishing precedent for how courts would treat child witnesses going forward. The prosecution presented first. Hayes, the assistant district attorney, called her expert witness, Dr. Michael, a prominent psychologist specializing in child trauma and eyewitness testimony. Doctor presented peer-reviewed research showing that therapy animals significantly reduced anxiety in traumatized children without compromising testimony accuracy. He cited studies from multiple universities, data from other jurisdictions that had implemented similar programs, and neurological evidence about how animals reduced cortisol levels in stressed individuals. The presence of the animal, doctor, allows the child's prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for rational thought and accurate memory recall, to function more effectively. When a child is in extreme anxiety, the amygdala, or fear center, becomes hyperactive, essentially hijacking the brain and preventing access to accurate memories. The calming presence of a trained animal helps regulate that fear response, allowing the child to access and communicate what she actually witnessed. Hayes pressed her point. This isn't about prejudicing the jury in favor of the prosecution. It's about leveling the playing field for a vulnerable witness who's been traumatized. Then took his turn. He was theatrical and passionate, standing before the bench with the bearing of someone absolutely certain of his moral and legal authority. "Your Honor," he began, his voice carrying the weight of righteous conviction, "what the prosecution is proposing is a Trojan horse. They're asking this court to allow an emotional appeal disguised as medical necessity. Yes, the animal might calm the witness, but that's precisely the problem. A calm witness might testify more coherently, appear more credible, seem less like she's been coached or confused. The jury won't be evaluating her testimony on its merits. They'll be influenced by the emotional manipulation of having a police officer's dog in the courtroom." He called his own expert, Dr. Mulligan, a defense expert who argued that testimony reliability depended on the actual accuracy of a witness's memory, not on their comfort level during testimony. She argued that allowing animals in the courtroom set a dangerous precedent that could be exploited by prosecutors across the country. "If we allow this, Dr. Mulligan, what's next? Emotional support animals for all witnesses, religious symbols for witnesses of faith. We're opening Pandora's box." The hearing lasted 6 hours. Judge sat silently for much of it, his expression unreadable, occasionally taking notes, asking pointed questions of both sides. Finally, he adjourned the hearing and told both attorneys he would issue his ruling the following Monday morning, the same day the trial was set to begin. Over the weekend, Judge did something he rarely did. He took work home and stayed up late into the night. He reviewed all the research materials provided by both sides. He read appellate decisions about child witness testimony. He consulted with his law clerk about the precedents. But more than that, he thought about his own granddaughter, who was 8 years old and lived in fear after witnessing a car accident. He thought about what it would take for her to testify about what she'd seen, and whether his rigid adherence to procedure would actually serve justice or simply perpetuate trauma. Around midnight on Sunday, Judge made his decision. Monday morning arrived gray and cold, with dark clouds threatening rain. The courtroom was even more packed than it had been for the Friday hearing. Media outlets had picked up the story Judge Way's unprecedented police dog testimony support. Legal blogs were already debating the merits. This case had become bigger than just one burglary. It had become a test case for how the judicial system would adapt to protect vulnerable witnesses. Judge entered the courtroom at 9:00 a.m. sharp. He carried papers in his hand, his written decision, prepared in careful detail. He sat down at his bench and surveyed the room, the packed gallery, the 2 attorneys at their tables, Emma and sitting in the front row looking terrified, Detective sitting behind the prosecution, and Officer Sarah waiting with Duke in an adjacent room. "This matter is unusual," Judge began, his voice steady and measured. "Both sides have presented compelling arguments. The defendant has constitutional rights that this court takes seriously. The young witness has been traumatized and deserves protection. These interests are in tension." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle over the courtroom. "After careful consideration of the law, the research, and my obligations to both justice and fairness, I'm making a decision that deviates from typical courtroom procedure, but I believe it is the right one." Michael leaned forward, his jaw clenching. I am permitting Officer Duke's presence in the courtroom during the witness's testimony, Judge announced. However, I'm imposing strict limitations. He outlined his conditions. Duke would be positioned beside the judge's bench, somewhat out of direct jury view, so the animal's presence wouldn't dominate the courtroom's visual landscape. Before Emma, the judge would explicitly instruct the jury that Duke was present solely for the witness's emotional support and well-being, and that his presence should not be considered any form of endorsement by law enforcement or the court regarding her testimony's reliability. The jury will be instructed, he continued, that they must evaluate her testimony based on its substance, the accuracy and consistency of her account, its corroboration with physical evidence, not on any emotional factors related to the animal's presence. Immediately stood, objecting vigorously. Your Honor, this is error. This is clearly prejudicial. We object on constitutional grounds and move for disqualification of this witness or, alternatively, removal of the animal. Objection noted and overruled, Judge replied firmly. We begin trial tomorrow morning at 9:00 a.m. That evening, Emma sat in her bedroom with her mother, processing the news. Officer had called with the decision. For the first time since the crime occurred, Emma smiled broadly, a genuine, hopeful smile. Duke gets to be there, she asked, her voice trembling with emotion. Duke gets to be there, confirmed, pulling her daughter close. Emma closed her eyes and whispered, I can do this. With Duke, I can do this. Outside, the rain began to fall, washing the city clean, as if preparing it for the storm that would come with the trial. The morning of Emma's testimony arrived with harsh sunlight breaking through clouds that had finally cleared. Emma woke at 5:30 a.m., her internal anxiety clock operating on overdrive despite not having a nightmare for the first time in months. She lay in bed for 20 minutes, her heart racing, her stomach tied in knots, acutely aware that this day, this single day, would determine whether faced justice or walked free from the courtroom a vindicated man. Found her daughter in the kitchen at 6:00 a.m., Emma sitting at the table in her pajamas, having poured herself a glass of juice that she was too nervous to drink. Emma looked smaller than usual, diminished by the weight of what lay ahead. Sat beside her and simply held her hand, knowing that words of reassurance had grown hollow through repetition. Do you remember what Officer said, asked quietly, about Duke knowing what to do? Emma nodded. Duke believes in me. That's right, and so do I, and so do all those people who've been working to help you tell the truth. The light blue dress Emma had chosen weeks ago hung in her closet, the one she'd picked herself because it made her feel brave. She dressed slowly, deliberately, as if putting on armor before heading into battle. Braided her hair carefully, taking extra time with each strand, these moments of maternal preparation, one of the few things she could control in a situation that felt increasingly beyond anyone's control. They arrived at the courthouse at 8:15 a.m. The scene was overwhelming. Media trucks lined the street, their satellite dishes pointed skyward like modern monuments to public curiosity. Reporters recognized Emma immediately, rushing toward them with cameras and microphones. Emma, how are you feeling? Are you nervous? Do you think the defendant is guilty? Detective was waiting for them at the courthouse entrance. He gently guided them through the media gauntlet, shielding Emma from the cameras while maintaining his professional composure. His presence was reassuring, a reminder that there were adults who believed in her, who'd spent months preparing her for this moment. Inside the courthouse, the hallways were crowded but quieter than outside. Emma recognized some faces. Mrs. Henderson was there, looking anxious but determined. Several police officers stood in clusters, their uniforms lending gravity to the proceedings. But Emma's focus was narrowed to a single point, finding Officer Sarah and Duke. Officer was waiting in a quiet holding area with Duke, who was wearing his official police service vest, a dark blue garment with gold lettering that identified him as a certified therapy and service animal. Despite the formality of the vest, Duke's demeanor remained exactly as Emma remembered: calm, centered, completely present. When Duke saw Emma, his tail wagged once, not frantically but with measured recognition. Officer allowed Emma to approach the dog and wrap her arms around his neck in a brief embrace. She breathed in his familiar scent, felt the warmth of his body, the steady rhythm of his breathing. For the first time that morning, Emma's own breathing slowed. "You've got this," Officer whispered. "Duke and I will be right there. Remember what we practiced." At 9:00 a.m. sharp, Judge took the bench. The courtroom was packed to capacity. Nearly 300 people, including media representatives, legal observers, child advocacy advocates, law professors who'd come to witness this unprecedented case, and curious members of the public. The jury had already been seated, 12 men and women who would determine fate based primarily on the testimony of a 7-year-old girl. Emma was called to the stand. She walked through the courtroom on her mother's arm, her small figure dwarfed by the massive wooden doors and high ceilings. Every eye in the room followed her progression. Some looked sympathetic, others curious. A few, particularly in Michael, with expressions of calculated assessment, as if evaluating their opponent before battle. Emma reached the witness stand and was helped up onto the raised platform by a court officer. The Bible was held before her by the court clerk. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?" the clerk asked. Emma's voice was small but audible. "I do." Judge leaned forward, his expression gentle despite his formidable judicial bearing. "Emma, before we begin, I want to explain something to you about the people here today. These are lawyers, judges, and other people whose job it is to help figure out what happened. I'm the judge, which means I make sure everyone follows the rules. Do you understand?" Emma nodded. "There's going to be a dog in the courtroom," Judge continued, gesturing slightly toward where Officer Duke would be positioned. "That dog is here because we want you to be comfortable and calm while you tell us what you saw. His name is Duke, and he's a very good dog. Having Duke here doesn't mean anything about whether what you say is true or not true. You understand. The jury will decide that based on what you tell them." Another nod from Emma. Judge nodded to Officer, who brought Duke into the courtroom and positioned him beside the judge's bench, exactly as had been predetermined. Duke lay down immediately, his massive body settling onto the courtroom floor with practiced ease. He was visible to Emma and the prosecution team, but positioned such that the jury could see him only if they deliberately looked to the side. His presence felt rather than dominating. The moment Duke lay down, Emma visibly relaxed. Her shoulders dropped. Her breathing, which had been rapid and shallow, deepened. The jury noticed the transformation, though Judge's instructions had specifically told them not to factor in Emma's comfort level. Hayes, the assistant district attorney, stood and approached the witness stand. She was a skilled prosecutor who'd worked extensively with child witnesses. She began gently, establishing Emma's basic information: her name, her age, where she lived, what school she attended. Simple questions designed to build confidence. "Emma, on the evening of September 15th, were you playing in your front yard?" "Yes," Emma answered, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "Can you tell us what happened that evening?" Emma took a breath and began her account. She described the sound of breaking glass, her curiosity, her cautious approach toward Mrs. Henderson's house. She described seeing the man through the porch light with remarkable clarity and precision. Hayes asked follow-up questions, but she was careful never to suggest answers, never to lead Emma's testimony. She simply allowed the girl to tell her story. As Emma, something remarkable happened. The anxiety that had consumed her for months seemed to lift with each accurate detail she provided. Her narrative became more confident, more detailed. She described the scar, the crooked nose, the leather jacket, the distinctive tattoo. She explained how she'd memorized his face, how she'd never forgotten a single feature. The courtroom listened in rapt attention. Even some of the hardened reporters seemed moved by this small girl's courage and clarity. Sat stone-faced at the defense table, his expression revealing nothing, but his jaw had tightened perceptibly as Emma's testimony systematically demolished his hopes for reasonable doubt. Hayes introduced photographs, pictures of taken when he was booked into custody following his arrest. She asked Emma to identify him in the photos. "Is this the man you saw on the night of September 15th?" Hayes asked, showing Emma a photograph. Emma looked at it for several seconds, her hand reaching down briefly to touch Duke's head before looking back at the photograph. "Yes," she said firmly, "that's him." Hayes showed her several more photographs, some of other men, a standard procedure to test whether Emma was simply identifying anyone shown to her or specifically recognizing the actual suspect. Emma correctly identified in each instance and rejected the photographs of other men. "Thank you, Emma," Hayes said finally. "I have no further questions." She sat down. The jury, despite Judge's instructions, seemed impressed by the testimony. Several jurors were nodding slightly, their body language suggesting they found Emma credible. Then Judge spoke the words everyone had been waiting for and dreading. "Mister, your cross-examination." Michael stood slowly, deliberately, with the bearing of someone about to perform a crucial surgical strike. He fastened his suit jacket and approached the witness stand with calculated steps. Emma's hand immediately moved to Duke, seeking reassurance. The real battle was about to begin. Michael approached the witness stand with the predatory grace of someone who'd spent decades perfecting the art of character assassination. He was a master of the cross-examination, the legal technique where a defense attorney could ask leading questions, suggest alternative narratives, plant seeds of doubt that would grow into forests of reasonable uncertainty. In his hands, cross-examination was both an art form and a weapon. He began with calculated casualness, as if he and Emma were simply having a friendly conversation. His voice was warm, almost avuncular, designed to lower her defenses before the real assault began. "Hello, Emma. My name is Michael. I'm the attorney representing the gentleman sitting at that table over there. Is it okay if I ask you some questions?" Emma looked toward Duke, finding strength in the dog's calm presence. "Okay," she whispered. "Emma, you were playing outside alone at night, correct?" asked. "Where was your mother during this time?" "She was inside. I could see her through the window," Emma replied, her voice already growing less confident. "But she couldn't see you clearly, could she? You were down in the yard and she was inside, perhaps occupied with other things." "Objection," Hayes interjected. "That's argumentative and assumes facts not in evidence." "Sustained," Judge ruled. "Mr. Rephrase." But the damage was subtle and effective. Had already planted the suggestion that Emma's mother wasn't properly supervising her, that Emma's account might be the product of an unsupervised child's imagination rather than reliable observation. Continued, his questions growing more pointed. "Emma, you mentioned you heard breaking glass and voices. Children sometimes misinterpret sounds, don't they? Maybe what you heard was something entirely different." "No, I heard," Emma began. "And then you approached the house, which was dark, correct? You couldn't actually see the person's face clearly, could you? Perhaps the light was playing tricks on your eyes." "The porch light was on," Emma protested, her voice becoming smaller. "I could see his face." Strategy was becoming clear. He wasn't attacking Emma directly. That would appear cruel and generate sympathy from the jury. Instead, he was systematically introducing alternative explanations for her observations, questioning her perception, suggesting her memory was unreliable or contaminated. He was treating her testimony as if it were the confused recollection of a child rather than the careful observation of someone with a documented photographic memory. "Isn't it true, Prest, that you've spoken with Detective multiple times about this incident? How many times would you say? 5 times, 10 times more. I don't remember exactly, Emma stammered. And during each of these conversations, Detective was showing you photographs, wasn't he? Pictures of different men, asking you if any of them were the person you saw. Yes, but... So you saw many photographs of men, some who resembled the person you saw, some who didn't. Isn't it possible that one of these photographs, perhaps shown multiple times, became implanted in your memory? That you began to associate that face with what you saw that night, even if it wasn't completely accurate? This was a sophisticated attack on eyewitness memory, the false memory phenomenon, was suggesting that Emma's repeated exposure to photograph had essentially created a false memory, replacing her actual recollection with a learned response. No, Emma said weakly, I remember his real face. But children's memories are very suggestible, aren't they, Emma? Your memory isn't as reliable as an adult's memory, is it? Emma's hands began to tremble. She reached toward Duke again, but now her movements were frantic, desperate, seeking reassurance that was beginning to feel insufficient against the relentless assault of questions. I know what I saw, Emma said, but her voice was barely audible. Shifted tactics, moving toward direct confrontation. Let me ask you something, Emma. When you saw this person's face through the porch light, you only saw him for a few seconds, correct? Perhaps 7 or 8 seconds at most. Yes, but I have a very good memory. I can remember. 7 seconds, interrupted. That's not a very long time, is it? In 7 seconds, you absorbed every detail of this person's face, his clothing, his physical characteristics, and stored them perfectly in your memory. A 7-year-old child's memory. The implications were clear. No 7-year-old could possibly memorize that much detail in 7 seconds. Was suggesting Emma was either lying or delusional. Emma's eyes began to water. Her voice shook as she tried to explain. My brain is different. I can remember things really good. My teacher says. Your teacher, said dismissively. But your teacher isn't a medical doctor, is she? She's not a neurologist or a psychologist. She's just a teacher making an observation. Judge interjected. Mister, please allow the witness to answer your questions. Of course, Your Honor, said smoothly, then immediately continued his assault. Emma, isn't it true that you've been working with a police dog, Officer Duke, to prepare for this testimony? Yes, but... And isn't it possible that all this time you've spent with the police, all this preparation, all this emotional support from law enforcement, has influenced you to tell the story they want to hear rather than what you actually remember? That's not true, Emma said, tears now streaming down her face. You're not certain it was my client, are you? You're just repeating what the police told you to say, what they've been training you to say through this therapy dog program. Emma looked down at her hands. She was shaking visibly now, her entire body trembling with the emotional force of the cross-examination. Officer, sitting in the courtroom behind the prosecution table, was visibly struggling not to intervene. Sitting in the gallery, had her hand over her mouth, tears streaming down her own face as she watched her daughter being systematically torn apart. Answer the question, pressed. You're not actually certain, are you? You could be wrong about my client's identity. Emma's voice broke completely. I don't know anymore. The courtroom went utterly silent. Those 4 words, I don't know anymore, hung in the air like a bomb that had just detonated. Smiled slightly, a barely perceptible expression of satisfaction. He'd accomplished his objective. He'd taken a credible witness, and through systematic psychological pressure and sophisticated questioning, reduced her testimony to doubt and confusion. I have no further questions, announced, walking back to his seat with the bearing of a man who just achieved victory. Judge looked at the witness stand where Emma sat, visibly shattered. Her face was streaked with tears. Her body had assumed a posture of complete defeat, shoulders hunched, head down, her entire demeanor one of a child who just realized she'd failed in the most important task of her life. "Ms. Hayes, do you wish to redirect?" Judge asked. Hayes stood, but she looked uncertain. How could she rehabilitate a witness who just declared she didn't know if she could identify the defendant accurately? Emma had been broken, systematically dismantled by a master of cross-examination. But before Hayes could begin her redirect examination, something extraordinary happened. Officer Duke, who had been lying calmly beside the judge's bench throughout the prosecution's testimony and most of his cross-examination, suddenly sensed something shift. His exceptional training had taught him to read human emotional distress with extraordinary precision. He recognized that the small girl on the witness stand, the girl he'd bonded with over weeks of preparation, the girl whose safety and he'd been trained to protect, was in acute psychological distress. Without any command from officer, without any signal or direction, Duke did something that violated protocol, something unscheduled and unexpected. He stood up and approached the witness stand. The courtroom erupted in gasps and whispers. Judge's gavel came down sharply. "Order, order in the courtroom." But it was too late. Officer Duke had already reached the witness stand and, in a move that seemed choreographed by fate itself, gently placed his massive head at the edge of the stand, directly in Emma's line of sight, his eyes meeting hers with the steady, unwavering gaze that had become so meaningful to her over their weeks together. Emma looked down into those eyes, eyes that held no judgment, no disappointment, no suggestion that she'd failed. Eyes that simply communicated, "I believe in you. You are not alone. You have courage." The moment stretched. 10 seconds passed. 20. The entire courtroom held its breath, watching as a traumatized child and a trained police dog locked in a moment of profound connection. Then Emma's hand moved, trembling but deliberate, to place itself gently on Duke's head. And something fundamental shifted inside her. For what felt like an eternity but was actually only 15 seconds, the entire Denver District Court seemed suspended in time. Emma Martinez, a traumatized 7-year-old girl, held her small hand on the head of Officer Duke, a 110-pound German shepherd, as approximately 300 people watched in absolute silence. Judge had stopped his attempt to restore courtroom order. The court reporter's fingers had stilled over her keyboard. Even Michael, who'd been preparing to object to whatever intervention Judge might attempt, stood frozen at the defense table. In those 15 seconds, something profound happened that would later be discussed in law schools and courtrooms across the country. Emma's entire body seemed to undergo a transformation. Her breathing, which had been rapid and panicked, slowed and deepened. The trembling in her hands stilled. Her shoulders, which had been hunched in defeat, straightened incrementally. Her eyes, which had been filled with despair and confusion, began to refocus. Duke didn't move. The dog simply remained in his position, his head resting at the edge of the witness stand, his dark eyes locked onto Emma's with unwavering presence. It was as if Duke was communicating through pure emotional transmission. "You are not broken. You are not defeated. Everything you witnessed was true. You know what you saw. I believe in you completely." Emma's hand, which had been lightly touching Duke's head, began to move with more purpose. She stroked his fur with deliberate, grounding motions. Her breathing synchronized with his breathing. Her heartbeat, which had been racing with panic, began to slow toward normalcy. The connection between the girl and the dog transcended the courtroom procedures and legal maneuvering. It was primal, profound, and absolutely genuine. After these transformative seconds, Emma's eyes moved away from Duke and upward. She looked directly at Judge, who was watching her with an expression of deep concern and recognition. Judge had spent 32 years presiding over trials, had seen countless witnesses testify, had witnessed human nature at its finest and most depraved. But he'd never seen anything quite like what was happening before him. Emma then turned her head, slowly and deliberately, until her eyes were locked directly on, sitting at the defense table, his face now displaying something other than calculated indifference. Shifted uncomfortably, clearly disturbed by the intensity of the child's gaze. His hands fidgeted on the table, his jaw clenched. The entire courtroom seemed to lean forward, anticipating what was coming. Every journalist present recognized they were witnessing a moment of extraordinary television. Every legal observer understood that this moment, whatever came next, would define the trial. Emma's mouth opened. Her voice, when it emerged, was different from anything the courtroom had heard all day. It was no longer the frightened whisper of a traumatized child. It was not the confused stammer of a broken witness. Instead, it carried the clarity and conviction of absolute truth. "That's him." 2 words, delivered with unwavering certainty, spoken with the kind of conviction that seemed to physically move through the courtroom like a shockwave. There was no hesitation, no qualification, no suggestion of doubt, just 2 words that carried the weight of complete, unshakable certainty. Judge's expression froze. His hand, which had been about to strike his gavel, remained suspended in midair. His eyes widened slightly, and for a moment the usually controlled judicial officer seemed visibly moved by what he just witnessed. Later, when asked by legal scholars and journalists about this moment, Judge would struggle to articulate what he'd seen. He would describe it as a transformation of character, a moment where a child found the deepest reserves of courage, a profound reminder of why we have a justice system in the first place. The jury's reaction was immediate and visceral. Several jurors straightened in their seats. One woman's hand went to her chest. Another juror's eyes welled with tears. The body language had shifted completely. What had been mounting uncertainty just minutes before had crystallized into unwavering belief in Emma's testimony. Michael's face had gone pale. He opened his mouth to object, but seemed to realize that any objection would only draw more attention to the moment of extraordinary clarity that had just occurred. He slowly sat back down, his strategic advantage evaporating in those 2 words. Hayes, the prosecution's attorney, was visibly fighting back tears. She'd worked cases for 15 years, but she'd never seen a witness recovery quite like this. The transformation from complete breakdown to unshakable conviction was, from a legal standpoint, extraordinary. Emma's voice, now that it had been unleashed, continued. Judge allowed her to continue speaking, recognizing that interrupting her would be inappropriate and perhaps legally problematic. With Duke's head still resting at the edge of the witness stand, Emma's hand still touching the dog, she began to speak with remarkable coherence. "I know what I saw," she said, her young voice filling the courtroom. "I was there. I saw his face in the light. I remember every part of it, the scar above his eye, the way his nose was broken, the jacket he was wearing, the tattoo on his arm. I didn't forget any of it. I was remembering it right, not forgetting it. And when Mr. kept asking me if I was sure, he made me confused, but I was still sure. I am sure. That man right there," she pointed directly at, "is the person who broke into Mrs. Henderson's house." The courtroom erupted, not in chaos, but in a kind of stunned recognition of what had just transpired. Judge's gavel came down once, sharply, not in anger but in acknowledgement of the profound moment that had just occurred. "Order, the courtroom will come to order," Judge announced, his voice carrying unusual emotion. Over the following 15 minutes, Emma continued her testimony, her voice growing stronger with each detail she provided. She described the sequence of events with crystalline clarity. She explained how Detective had never suggested to her what to say. He'd only asked her what she remembered. She articulated, with the vocabulary of a child but the perception of someone with genuine photographic memory, exactly what she'd witnessed that September evening. When Hayes asked her to identify one final time in the courtroom, Emma did so without hesitation. "That man," she said, pointing at, "he's the one." When attempted a brief redirect cross-examination, Emma answered each question with confidence and consistency. He'd lost his power over her. She'd been broken and had rebuilt herself through her connection with Duke. She discovered that her testimony was more important than her fear, and that her truth was stronger than anyone's attempt to manipulate it. The jury deliberated for 4 hours and 20 minutes. They returned with a verdict that surprised no one who'd been in the courtroom for Emma's testimony: guilty on all counts: burglary, theft, assault. The jury foreman later told journalists that Emma's testimony had been decisive. "We believed her completely," he stated. "You could feel it, her absolute certainty about what she'd witnessed." As Emma left the courtroom 2 weeks later following sentencing, she walked beside Officer Duke, her small hand resting on his back. Photographers captured the image: a 7-year-old girl and a police dog, linked together, having navigated one of the most emotionally intense courtroom experiences imaginable. The case became a landmark precedent. Within 18 months, 12 states had modified their rules regarding therapy animals in courtrooms with child witnesses. Within 3 years, that number had grown to 32 states. Judge's controversial decision, which had seemed so risky and procedurally questionable just months before, became viewed as a moment of judicial wisdom, a recognition that sometimes protecting vulnerable witnesses didn't compromise fairness. It enabled fairness. But beyond the legal precedents and the policy changes, what endured was the image of Emma and Duke, and the understanding that sometimes, when a child finds themselves in an impossibly difficult situation, what they need isn't another adult telling them what to do. What they need is to know they're not alone. What they need is someone, or something, that believes in them absolutely and unconditionally. Emma Martinez, the girl with the photographic memory, learned that day that her greatest strength wasn't her exceptional memory. It was her capacity for courage. And Duke, the therapy dog, learned what he'd been trained to understand but now knew in the deepest, most profound way: that his presence could change the trajectory of a human life. As they walked out of the courtroom together into the Denver sunshine, both girl and dog seemed to understand they'd participated in something larger than themselves, something that would reverberate through the justice system and change how society protected its most vulnerable members. Was sentenced to 8 years in prison. Mrs. Henderson's stolen items were returned, and the Martinez family received thousands of letters from people across the country who'd heard Emma's story and been inspired by her courage. But perhaps the most meaningful letter came from a mother in Georgia whose daughter had witnessed a crime and was terrified to testify. After reading about Emma's case and discovering that her state had modified its therapy animal policies, she'd brought her daughter to court with a therapy dog beside her. The daughter had clearly and effectively, and the case had been resolved with a conviction. In the margins of her letter, this mother had written, "Thank you for showing my daughter and the world that courage isn't about being fearless. It's about finding someone who believes in you and discovering that belief is more powerful than fear." That letter was framed in the Martinez home, hanging beside a photograph of Emma and Duke, a permanent reminder of the day a 7-year-old girl said 2 words that changed everything.